Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CANTO Conversations, a series of webinars which takes a look at the impact of COVID-19 on the telecoms industry and on the ICT industry more broadly. My name is David Cox, and I am the chairman of CANTO, and I will be your moderator this morning. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Michael Pryor, and we're very pleased to have him. Mr. Pryor is the CEO of ATN International, and he is going to share his viewpoints on how organizations can innovate and navigate through these difficult times. But allow me to just give you a little bit of information about Michael before we start. Michael T. Pryor has been President and Chief Executive Officer of ATN International since December 2005, and an officer of the company since June 2003. He was elected to the board in May 2008, and prior to joining the company, Mr. Pryor was a partner with Q Advisors LLC, which is a Denver-based investment banking and financial advisory firm focused on the technology and telecommunications sectors. Mr. Pryor began his career as a corporate attorney with Cleary Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton LP in London and New York. He received a BA degree from Vassar College and a JD degree, summa cum laude, from Brooklyn Law School. Mr. Pryor currently serves on the board of directors of the Competitive Carriers Association, and in 2008, Mr. Pryor was named Entrepreneur of the Year for the New England region by Ernst & Young LLP, and one of America's best CEOs by DeMarsh Associates Incorporated. Michael, with that incredible history and background, welcome to CANTO Conversations. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Good morning, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and good morning, all.
Thanks. We're really excited to have someone of your background and experience with us. But I think, you know, a good place for us to start would be to give our audience a sense of ATN International. Tell us a little bit about, you know, the company, the business, and where you think it is at the moment.
Sure, and I'll keep this brief, David, because I know the company commercials are not usually people's main interest, but ATN's been around for a while. We've been around for 3 decades, and in the region for that entire time. We now actually have operations on 4 continents, believe it or not, for a relatively small company. We have over 1,600 employees. And but our main focus is still the Caribbean and rural areas of mainland United States. They really form the bulk of our operations. So we have a history of, we've been both the incumbent provider, and we are challenger in many markets, probably more than we are an incumbent. And we've kind of specialized in going into areas where we saw a lack of infrastructure or a lack of competition, you know, maybe a single operator. And we felt that there was a long-term plan to build a high-quality communications company and invest in next generation networks and go from there. So that continues to be what drives us. And it's, I would say that the telecom industry has become exceedingly fast moving, fast changing. Like most things, it's changing from a combination of technology and consumers' use of technology. So it's really exciting times. It's also challenging because changes both. But you know, that's really the nutshell of it. I should add, I mean, we're in all the communications areas. We do retail and wholesale. We do wireline. We do long haul fiber. We do all the mobile.
Sounds like you're in everything.
Yes. Well, you have to be. I think the markets demand it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you know, I'm going to pick up on that because I really want to get into a little bit about, you know, a little bit about how the industry's been changing, not just AT&I, but how the industry you think is going to be impacted by COVID and what the future looks like. But before I get to that, I want to understand a little bit. I mean, it's the obvious question, but everybody, you know, we've asked everyone, how has COVID impacted operations? You know, obviously you said you're across 4 continents. We want to know, you know, where there have been acute impacts, but our interest, of course, is in the Caribbean, mostly.
Hmm. Well, the good news to date is that I am not aware of, it's possible something's happened very recently, but we have not had adverse health impacts for our employee base. So that's first, right? That's the first thing you worry about, particularly when you're in the business with obviously retail stores to start. A lot of that's closed or restricted now compared to where it was before, when the pandemic started and everyone was getting aware of it. We also have in-home installation. That also has been, much restricted since then. But given all that we do and the fact that we provide an essential service and have to keep doing it, even more essential, obviously, during the pandemic. I mean, we've been very, very fortunate. And I think it's maybe more than fortunate. I think our operating leaders, our business leaders, have been just excellent they moved very quickly to safeguard the employees, to safeguard customers, and to figure out ways to deliver services effectively under these restrictions. So, I think the impact I worry more about I worry about the markets we're in, the economic impacts on the markets, and obviously on the good news is that there's been, this has kind of forced us and our customers, our workers, everybody, staff, management, customers, to really embrace digitization. It's been something we've been pushing for a while, a strategy to digitize our operations, digitize our interactions with our customers. And there's nothing like having to do something to getting you to do quickly. And
we've been hearing that from a number of CEOs. So it's interesting to hear that you've had a similar experience. Talk us through that a little bit, this journey towards digitization, and what you think it means for ATN and your customers. Tell us a little bit about how you've managed that during one of the most difficult times for any company.
Yeah, well, it starts with basic. First of all, we had been making the investments to create digital capabilities, right? There's a lot of systems and a lot of onboarding of systems and onboarding employees into systems that we had been doing anyway, pre-pandemic, and made a lot of investment in that. So we were ready in that sense. And really what I would emphasize is it was more about adoption, right? So it was more about helping to train and encourage employees, field operations, field techs to use the tools. And the same thing with the customers. So I really think it's that basic. You had to have been ahead of the curve a little bit, making those investments, going to a full digitized operation. But then the next thing, the big hurdle was, consumer, customer, employee behavior. And I was, I'm one of those people, right? I don't know how many Zoom calls I did, a few, before the pandemic, and getting used to the tools and how to make it work.
Have you been surprised at the pace of adoption? What do you think has been the response of customers to these changes that you've had to make as a company?
Very positive. I mean, people, no matter where, people are great at moving to do things that make sense to them, right? So, the pandemic made it clear and apparent to make sense for them, and adoption has been pretty quick. I think it helped. Probably, I'm guessing, if looking at my own family, that it helped that there are a lot of younger people at home with older people who can help them navigate it and get used to it. And I really think that's it. I think that the key was necessity.
Understood. Now, I want to talk a little bit about you've talked about the economics of it, and you've mentioned that that's your main concern. You've talked about the fact that, your company has done a relatively good job of keeping your employees safe. And, I congratulate you on that. You are correct. That is a sign of the leadership, the quality of leadership that you've got along the business. But the financial impact is something which I'm not sure, people who aren't in the business understand. What are some of your concerns there? What are some of the things that you've seen, the trends you've observed, and sort of as you know, as we move towards the end of the year, what are some of the things that sort of worry you a bit?
I think, first of all, there's a macroeconomic worry in many markets that just is worrisome, right? A lot of businesses in difficulty and pain, and therefore their employees and so on. So that has effects that ripples up to government and government revenues and things like that. But what I also see is there's really been an acceleration of an issue we're already facing, which is there's ever increasing demand for connectivity. It's connectivity, faster, more places, lower latency, more capacity, I guess that, faster, right? And wherever and whenever you want it. So I think that the focus for the companies now, the operators, as well as the regulators, has to be, how do we deal with this increasing demand and the very large investments that the operators continue to have to make to keep up to this demand and anticipate it, with with the fact that the user is sort of converging their use of all the different technologies of connectivity, but they can't really afford to pay much more than they have been, right? So it's not like people are adding on lots of services and increasing share of wallet. For the most part, it's the same share of wallet and more services. And there's a lot of, I think what most consumers don't realize, and not surprisingly, is how from the voice-dominated telecommunications world to the data world, just what is involved in delivering that service. I mean, there is just a tremendous amount of capital expense as well as operating expense in order to really build robust, reliable data systems. And I mean, from everything from your undersea connections to your terrestrial connections to the radio interface to, it just goes on and on. And so we're doing what we need to do. That's the reality. We have to figure out ways to deliver it more efficiently, deliver it faster. But I do think that's a key area if I think of a CANTO topic.
Yeah.
How we can cooperate.
Yeah, look, so I've said that COVID presents it's an existential crisis to the telecoms industry, because that issue that you've highlighted to me is really at the heart of the challenge that the entire industry is facing, which is there is more need now for our services. There is a greater need for broadband, faster speeds, better quality of service, but people's ability to pay for those investments and for the network is significantly reduced. And I wanted to touch on one area that you talked about just impliedly, which is about the way technology has changed the industry. 20 years ago, voice was king, and we didn't have all of these other players in the market, which we basically had to share revenue. We've now seen this trend of customers moving to these edge providers, and what's been the impact of that on ATN's operations, and what do you think people don't understand about the impact for us in terms of our ability to invest in the network?
Yeah, that is a key area of concern. So, the over-the-top applications, they've designed great applications. They're attractive. They make sense to users, but they are driving tremendous economies, tremendous revenues off the back of the investment that the operators have made. And you hear that lament from operators around the world. It's very difficult because, as I said, you're investing in all this capability, and someone else is selling off it, and you're not really able to. to the same extent. But what you can't do is say, well, we have to stop those things. That's not the right answer, right? These are things your customers want. They're attractive to them. They're used to them. So that can't be the answer. You know, our job should be enabling connectivity, enabling use of technology, embracing it. And so, you know, the first thing I do in regard to that is I put the pressure on us. We'll figure out how to make it work, right? Figure out how to make this changing business environment work for you. That is far and away the most important thing. But it's tough. It's in a tough environment, and you know we have increasing regulatory fees in a lot of places. On top of all this, at the same time, we have increasing expenditures, and of course, in the markets in the Caribbean, of course, none of these over-the-top providers is resident in that market. So there's no tax revenue, there's no circle back of any of that revenue to the region. And, you know, in the old days of the, you know, voice-driven world, there were effectively money flowing in from out of region for the long-distance calling, and then from roaming revenue. You know, long-distance calling, you know, is you know, nothing compared to it was, in part because of over the top and other means of communication. And roaming's not anywhere where it was. It's totally different world. Just because of the, again, over the top and some, you know, business environment aspects of it as well. So I think the real challenge for these small markets is figuring out how, with the revenue stream you do have in market, you make that still work for continued investment in technology, because if you don't, it will hold the society back. There's no doubt about it. It's, you know, it's like the growth of energy usage from electric power on. That's the way connectivity is. It's absolutely table stakes for economic activity and growth.
Yeah. Do you think that regulatory authorities, governments, public authorities understand that tension? Do you think they understand the amount of debt, for example, the amount of capital that's necessary to keep those investments current, to make sure they get the best available services? Do you think they understand how difficult that is in the current environment, or do you think there's still a lack of understanding about that?
I think there is a lack of understanding. I'm sure there are regulators who fully understand it, but you know, generally as a body, and what we see is there's still a bit of an old utility mindset, and sometimes that's the operators have to worry about that, getting rid of that old utility mindset, and sometimes it's the regulators, and sometimes it's both, and it's, you know, this is not like electric power, which has really fundamentally stayed the same. It is changing really rapidly. So I think it's really hard to appreciate. I mean, we're trying to do our part, and I know CANTO is. I mean, I think that's a really important role for CANTO to play, to help educate the regulators, give them access to information, help them understand, really what's behind all the network, what it costs to care and feed, to build, care, feed, for that network. So I do think that understanding isn't where it needs to be, but I believe the operators have to help get it there, right? It's a communication.
Understood. And I'll return to this theme of what CANTO can do to help. I'm very glad you brought that up. But before we get to that, I do want to talk a little bit more about ATN in particular, and just I want to talk about the future and what you think the future will look like for your businesses, going forward. What do you think it's going to look like for customers? What do you think it's going to look like for employees? What do you think it's going to look like just from a pure business point of view? What does the future look like to you, Michael?
I think number one way to think about it is we already are moving fast in this direction, but we are going to be a technology partner, a trusted technology partner. Our job is to help people access technology, digital tools, so much of life, as we talked about earlier, the pandemic is accelerating it. So much of life is through those tools. Now learning and health are going to be, more and more in that way, in addition to, just base communications, obviously information, content, leisure, entertainment. It all comes through that relationship, and you cannot just build network and charge for it. You have to figure out where your customer needs to go, how to help make life easy for them, how to help them use technology in a way that helps their lifestyle, their productivity, whatever. So I think that's the fundamental mindset we're trying to get embraced throughout our organization is that partner. If you become a trusted technology partner, you have a good business. So you just have to keep anticipating the needs. You have to invest wisely. You can't afford a lot of big investments in technology that don't prove out. So, that's not easy, but that's where we have to go. And I think that's a big change, right? And it's a big change for everybody in terms of how operators think of themselves, how customers see them, how government sees the operators.
That's a really great answer, and I appreciate your perspective on that. I do want to now sort of pivot a little bit to talk about, you mentioned it about CANTO, and you've covered it a little. Do you think CANTO can add value to companies like ATN? What are some of the things that you think CANTO can do well, and what are some of the things, or do you have any thoughts about what other things that CANTO could do to support your companies, particularly in the region?
Yes, I mean, I think the first area and most important thing is a forum for operators and regulators to network, understand understand what's going on, understand different perspectives from either side, and think proactively about the future. I think that convening and education capability is hugely important, and it's much more important now than it was even 10 years ago because of how fast moving things are. And I think that the nature of things is there's always a little bit of distrust between the regulated and the regulator. It's a natural tension there. But if you get together in a bigger forum and group like this, I think it encourages people to open their minds a little bit on both sides and understand more and think about solutions, right? Not think about the problems, as much and lament the problems, but think forward and anticipate. So I know CANTO is working on that, and I think that's a really valuable role. I think another thing CANTO can do along those lines is it can encourage interaction with other telecom trade organizations to get thoughts about trends, practices, ideas. A lot of what it's a small region, it's small markets, but there are other small markets around the world that have similar issues. So I think that could be an area that CANTO could explore in the future.
Thanks. That's incredibly helpful feedback, and we appreciate that. One thing that I'm very keen to understand your perspectives on, I think it's important, is on leadership, particularly during times of crisis. I mean, you've been a leader in this business for a long time. Clearly, you have fantastic history, and you've been in your current position for several years. I want to understand a little bit about you, and these are not necessarily. This is not necessarily a conversation that's restricted to just the telecoms industry, but I wanted to get your thoughts on leading people during these sorts of times, during times of crisis, and leading companies successfully in difficult circumstances. what has been your experience over the last few years? What are some of the things that you think that COVID perhaps has brought to light that you may not have considered before? Just tell us a little bit about your thoughts on leadership.
Well, I think first thing I would say is I'm still learning. I've learned a lot of lessons just in this crisis. And I learn a lot from the structure of ATN as we give a lot of authority and autonomy to the business leaders in market. They know their markets, they know their people. And so what happens in times like this is it's very interesting to watch the things they do. And and fairly often I say, I don't know if I would have thought of that. That's a great idea. That's great. It's a great thing. So first I want to say that we have a lot of great leaders within the organization that have done great things. And I think what I would say are the important attributes of it, particularly in that crisis kind of situation, is you have to move with urgency. You have to move with creativity, but you can't panic. You can't show any hint of panic. You definitely can't do that. You've got to show decisiveness and a forward direction. If anyone spent time in small boats, you know that you're most unstable when you just let the waves play you. If you get forward motion, it's a lot easier to keep the boat stable. So you've got to have forward motion. You got to give people a reason to believe and a sense of purpose and go. And you also can't be too afraid about making mistakes, right? Because if you're too afraid of making mistakes, you get paralyzed in these situations. We try to embrace here, all right, go ahead, make decisions, measure it, watch it carefully. If it looks like it was the wrong decision, change it quickly, right? So that's I think, a very, useful thing to remember. And then I think, other part of leadership is you've got to have credibility. People have got to believe that, what you say is what you mean, and your word matters. And you don't just say what's expedient or puff things up, because then, as soon as people realize that's what's going on, you've lost any power to lead them. So I guess those are the things that come to mind for me.
That's it's a fascinating perspective. You've talked about being adaptable, being able to make decisions quickly, being decisive, trying to make sure that you have a focus and you're moving forward. You've talked about being humble, being able to admit mistakes, and I think you're just spot on. I think it resonates, and it'll probably resonate with a lot of our audience, that those are the sorts of qualities that underlie and underpin the best companies around. So I think it's a fascinating perspective, and in particular, about COVID. One thing that was true of all of us is we had to make decisions extremely quickly. And for you, that can't be. I can imagine that you've got businesses, as you say, spread out across the world. How do you inspire that sort of that sort of spirit in a company as diverse as that? And what are some of the things that you're looking for when you're trying to pick leaders?
I think the mentality I think of that leads to those, quick action, good decision making, thoughtful in terms of, caring for their customers as well as their employees, really is a business owner, right? That's the attributes of a good business owner. So that's what we want, good business owners. And that's not just, the CEO of an operating business. It's everybody. It's people who own different functions within the business, support groups. It's really an ownership mentality. Like okay, I own my employees' experience and health, and I own my customers' experience and health and so on. So if you have that mentality, right, like every good, successful small business person, I don't care if you have a one-man shop, you know, a bar or whatever, you know those places that are going to be successful because the owner's all over it. The owner embraces the whole business, and they embrace their customer, and they know they're only in business so long as they're exciting, delighting their customer and caring for their customers. So we have those people. We seek those people, and you know, we'll make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but if you have the right motives, you're going to be right more often than you're wrong.
Understood. We have a question from Flavia Lima, and Flavia asks, with COVID-19, how different or alike are the challenges ATN has been facing between the operations in the USA, rural markets, and the Caribbean markets?
They're similar in a lot of ways. And frankly, a number of our Caribbean markets have, partly because they're islands, were able to shut down and have less of an issue. So an example would be one area we operate in the US rural markets is we helped fund and start a competitor. There was only one provider in the Navajo Nation, which is an area in southwestern United States, the Navajo, their lands, and it's about 100,000 people, but it's quite a big area. It's around the size of the state of Georgia, I think. And they have had, unfortunately, really bad health impacts from COVID-19. It's been a significant issue, and so it's been really challenging because we're providing a critical service, and our partners, and indeed the majority owners, are the Navajo. So we work very closely with them and the tribal leadership. So that's been a challenge unlike anything we've seen in the U.S. And one of the first things we had to do there was it's a very remote area with a lot of people live a lot, you know, in a long way from any infrastructure, including water, believe it or not. And we had to figure out a way to get more students connections in really remote areas because they all were forced to learn from home. So we worked with the tribe and the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, our partners, to come up with solutions around that. It has been helpful in the U.S. One difference on the positive side to make it a little easier in the U.S. and in the U.S. Virgin Islands is that the U.S. federal government has put a fair amount of money into supporting our customers, basically. And so that enabled us to do more and to support our employees longer and those kinds of things. So it's different in that respect, but it's the same in the sense that we're typically in a market that's pretty small with two players, and we both are trying to solve the same problem, which is how to troubleshoot issues when you can't send someone into somebody's home, right? Or they don't want to go into somebody's home, and you're seeing demand spike at times and places that you never used to, right? Which is, all the operators on this call will appreciate. That's part of network design. That's a real challenge when you have those things change. So that's been the same.
And that brings me to one area that I wanted to explore with you, which is about the role of regulators, and also particularly in the context of universal service. I mean, the FCC, one of the first things that the FCC did when COVID began was it started this Keep America Connected initiative. But a lot of people don't realize that it sort of put its money where its mouth was by sort of standing up for the industry. Tell us a little bit about that. And I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but just help our audience understand why that was important for a company like ATN, which has these, which is in so many parts, has these rural markets. Why is that support important?
That support's very important. Now, I think some of the story on that Connect America support is still, not Connect America, that's a different program, but this, we keep it connected, keep America connected. Some of that's still being worked out, but in the past, the FCC has had a history of helping and support rural connectivity, right? So there's a number of programs, subsidies, and so on, because it's just, there's just not a business model to make it work in a lot of these far-flung communities. And for the audience, to, most people here will understand it, but just conceptually, if you take network and you have to deliver it a long way from sources and the revenue is very sparse, you still have the same network requirements as you have in a highly dense place with much more revenue. So it's challenging. And so the FCC has always had a practice of supporting that. And it's been an imperative driven in part by Congress to support the rural areas, much like the original rural electrification. So there's a number of programs there, and they've changed over the years, and the regulators have gotten involved at times to say they weren't efficient enough and they make it a little more competitive and challenging to get the funds, which I think was appropriate. And in fact, we built out a lot of rural areas, probably 100,000 square miles of rural areas in one of those programs where incumbents hadn't. And we were able to build out these really rural areas with mobility and now fixed wireless solutions for broadband. And also we had, the Virgin Islands is a great example, U.S. Virgin Islands. Of course, everyone in the region remembers some, 2 Category 5 hurricanes coming through in 2017. Well, we got a lot of support from the FCC to, emergency funding, expertise, coming to look at this and try to figure out solutions. And, that kind of thing, it's easier, right? It's easier to do. The US a big country, and it's easier to set aside some money for rural areas than some of the other markets we're in. But I think it's a good model.
Just a quick anecdote. Chairman Pai was our guest speaker, our featured speaker, a couple of years ago in Panama for a CANTO conference. And he spoke in very eloquent terms about how important universal service was to him. Believe he came, he's originally from Iowa, and he talked about how the efforts of the FCC, frankly, to keep those rural communities connected was a particular passion for him. And it's interesting to hear your contrast between the support that you've seen yourself in the United States, in the rural United States, versus what's happening in the Caribbean. I know that ATN is in Guyana and some other markets in the region. Mm-hmm. Without getting into specifics, do you have any thoughts on how regulatory and government authorities, say in places like Guyana, with huge large rural communities, etc., could help support itself and companies there to expand broadband and access?
Yes, and first of all, I note that you're absolutely right about Chairman Pai. I've met with him several times, and he walks the talk. He does truly believe that, and at the same time, he's also very protective of the federal treasury. So he puts a lot of pressure to try to make all the programs efficient, and that's a good combination, right? And has been pretty effective. So. If you think about an example like Guyana, and I think this is true in a number of places, there's a bunch of things regulators can do that they're quite easy, I think, to make it a little easier for the operators to expand operations and deliver to more people. One of which is, for some reason in all these markets, I guess I understand it, but and some markets are different than others, but they really hold back spectrum, right? Or they make using spectrum extremely expensive. Well, they have an absolute enormous abundance of spectrum for the size of these markets, every one of these. And it is a public trust, right? The spectrum, and I get that, but you need to create, spectrum is so critical to being able to deliver more capacity at lower cost, right? Which is really what is needed. And if you're able to do that in more areas, that also helps you with coverage, right? Having the right spectrum for different types of coverage, whether it's rural or in building or high density areas, high capacity areas. So, you know, what we've seen in our markets is just this, you know, we and our competitors say like they're holding back spectrum that could really improve consumers' experience. And at the same time, they keep charging more, and there's nothing changing on the customer side. So that's a real inhibitor to investment on the margins, right? So it's a lot easier to invest in the marginal areas, in the rural areas, and expand that if you essentially subsidize that with a little bit denser areas. So either you can have what the US federal government's doing is having the government subsidize rural thing directly, or you can subsidize it the way they did in the old AT&T monopoly in the US, where there's a monopoly that makes enough money in New York City to build rural New York, right? So, and had an obligation to do so, right? And that was, so right now we're not at a good position with that. The basic regulatory fees are going up in a lot of places. And there's a lot of sort of regulating the past instead of let's let the future, you know, go at a little lighter touch, encourage development, and then step in if you need to correct, you know, market abuses. I think all those things can help improve the investment case for the more marginal areas, and because it's not just places like Guyana, it's, you know, there's a number of islands in the Caribbean nations that have smaller islands that are very poorly covered with poor population because there's no economic case for it. It's very similar concept. So you either can do that or you can create a universal service obligation. The problem with that is, you know, typically in these markets, you know, given the size, you have two operators. So if each operator is recovering a universal service payment fee from all of its users, that's how it works in the US, and then the authority awards that to subsidize rural development, you're actually asking the consumer to pay for it very directly. And I think I would first use these other tools: spectrum, lower fees, more light touch regulation to encourage the investment.
Understood. And that's a fascinating perspective. And I think worth thinking about, perhaps, you know, more deeply in a future CANTO webinar. So someone's asked, one of our audience members has asked, you know, where do you think regulators can go to get more information and guidance about the industry? I mean, what do you think regulators should be doing in order for them to basically understand, you know, the way the market works from our perspective?
Well, honestly, I mean, there are a number of sources. There's tons of information everywhere, right? So you can go to conferences and see the papers that were presented, the decks. You can watch the videos. I mean, really, there's no lack of resources, but I do think it falls on the carriers a little bit, and through organizations that they belong to, like CANTO, to think of ways to do that, right? So, you know, you give people a 30-page white paper with a lot of technical jargon. I mean, no industry in the world has jargon like telecom. It's ridiculous, right? It's acronym soup. And, you know, that's a good way to fall asleep, but it's maybe not a good way to educate. So I think you got to engage. You got to have roundtables, invite them to discussions. And, you know, so the main thing they can do is participate in those things. If they participate in those things, they will learn quite quickly what it's like, right? So you can easily have a discussion about what does it take to build 21st century data network, mobile data network, fixed data network, what's involved in it. And you can keep it high enough level to not drown people in the details. So I think their participation in those things that really engage them would probably be the best tool. And we've done some things like that. Like, so for example, we've gotten the FCC to provide expertise and fellow regulators to help the regulators in Guyana, for example, understand, you know, again, 21st century competitive telecom environment, what's involved, what are the technologies, what are the issues. So individual operators can certainly help. I'm sure, you know, Liberty Cable Wireless, you do that. I'm sure Digicel does that. I mean, it's important. It's important.
Yeah, and you've touched on one of the things that's very core to CANTO, one of our core principles, which is about, you know, about education, about trying to make information accessible. We try, obviously, as operators, we don't always succeed because we have very strong views on some issues. But one of CANTO's core objectives is to try to engender dialogue, promote dialogue, and educate without trying to push any one particular position too much. Obviously, as I said, you know, sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. But you know, I want to talk a little bit about that issue that you raised about, you know, the support for the FCC, the support from the FCC to companies like ATN in the context of providing support or getting access to rural communities. And one of the things that, you know, is very key in the Caribbean is this deficit of trust. I think on the one hand, we have a number of regulatory authorities with universal service funds that have, you know, that have money that haven't been used. But on the other hand, we, I think, also have a concern among some public authorities that, okay, if we give certain subsidies, how can we be sure that you will, you know, get services to the communities at the prices that we want? Take us through, you know, how it works in North America, and perhaps if you can try to extrapolate a little bit of that for us in the region. In other words, how does the FCC make sure that when it provides support to get services to the Navajo Nation, that your company is going to do it in a way that ultimately helps achieve their objectives?
Yeah, so they used to do sort of annual steady subsidies based on effectively your customer base, right? And some math around your cost base. That has really changed and been changing in recent years. Again, Chairman Pai has been a big part of that. And it's been changing to an approach that says, you know, we want coverage in such and such place, and we want it at this level, minimum level, let's say, you know, 25 megabits minimum level mobile. Tell us who wants to do that and for how much they will do it for, what kind of reward. So it's kind of a reverse auction process. That is we participate in something called the Mobility Fund, then the Connect America Fund, and there's a new one, the very large fund called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And they address different things, you know, some mobility and some fixed broadband, but they've been going through that approach, right? And then that's not enough, though, right? I think the real trick is to have the resources and capability and clarity to say, okay, here's what we will provide, here are the standards you need to meet, and here's how we're going to measure it, when we're going to measure it. And so you have to be very careful, because what you can have, and this has happened in a couple FCC programs, is you had a bunch of people like in the Connect America Fund bid to cover a certain area. And these were groups of people with no operating history, maybe some connections or whatever. And I'm not suggesting anything untoward happened, but they bid. And then they realize, it looks like I won a lot of money, but it's going to cost me more money to satisfy that requirement than I've won. And then it doesn't get built, right? So the whole program gets set back years in some area because someone was given the award who doesn't have the capability, isn't a proven operator. So you have to be very careful to what are your standards, what are the threshold requirements, and it's not easy, but there's a pretty good roadmap now of what works and what doesn't work. There's a lot of learnings that could be taken from that, and there's other methods to do it, right? But you basically have to have for the taxpayer, you need to make sure that the government money is well spent, right? Or in the Universal Service Fund, it's really the consumer's money that was collected. Now, is it well spent?
Understood. Michael, that's incredibly helpful. I think, our regulators and government authorities will certainly benefit tremendously from that perspective and that insight, because it's so striking that what you've described, despite the fact that you're talking about a market, United States, which is so much larger than any of the markets that we're dealing with here in the Caribbean, the issues are the same. And what you've talked about, I think, fundamentally comes down to two things. It's about leadership, and it's about having the right policy in place. I think those are important signposts for our regional leaders to understand. And I just want to take the opportunity to point out that we have in the audience Mr. Tom Sullivan, who is with the FCC and who sends his regards to you from Chairman Pai. So,
I'm glad I said something nice.
So are we. Thank you very much. And Tom, it's very good to have you. I have just a couple of questions, Michael, from the audience, and I do want to they've been very patient with us, and they do want to make sure we get to them. Someone's asking about, which subsidiary is poised to benefit, but I would, if I can, broaden the question to say, do you see, obviously COVID has been, some bad news for the industry, of course, but do you see opportunities from the digital push? Do you see any positives coming out of COVID? And then, what do you think that ATN International is in a good position to take advantage of any of those opportunities, if there are opportunities from this period?
Yeah, I think simply put, yes, we are. I think we're in a great position, and I think all communications providers are in a great position to, enable really positive moves forward as a result of this crisis, and to benefit from that, right? Which is why you're in business. So it's not going to be easy, and I think I do worry about the economic impacts on our markets. So that'll be the hard part. But look, I think this, with the pandemic, has made clear, like distance learning, telehealth, right? Telehealth has been talked about forever. And we serve a lot of communities that would hugely benefit from it. But it needs something like this to create, you really have no choice but for telehealth. So now do you create the low latency applications, the Internet of Things type environment that really enables that, and you get people used to it. As I said earlier, a bunch of times, it's about behavior, consumer behavior, user behavior, and technology. And I think it's huge. I think we're actually in the early innings of the connectivity revolution, and it's really, what I think of as an operator is our job is to keep upping the game of providing a really strong platform of connectivity. And then, the geniuses will come along and think of great use cases and applications for that will bring people forward. I mean, telehealth alone and distance learning can be such an equalizer, right? It can be so great for communities that are behind in certain outcomes. So I'm pretty excited about all that.
You know, interesting comments. It just brings home to me the point that, and it's one of the reasons that I love working in this industry, is that we're enablers, fundamentally. We enable so much of what our modern societies can do. We enable it, you know, financially, from education, from health. So much now depends on you know, the networks we provide and the connectivity we provide. So, you know, your comments really resonate, I think, with all of us. I just want to acknowledge a comment from one of the members of the board of CANTO, Ms. Krista Leith, who says that your comments, speaking earlier in reference to, you know, support for the industry and universal service, are just so right. And she's just pointing to the fact that so many operators, even within the region, have said exactly what you've said. So I think, you know, what's interesting to me is just the commonality that, again, despite the differences in scale, we are all as an industry facing, you know, effectively the same issues.
Yeah.
Michael, we're coming to the end of the program, and I just want to thank you again for being here. We are incredibly privileged to have you. Michael, I want to leave the last word to you. Any last thoughts that you want to share with our audience before we just finally wrap up?
Not really. I think I've learned in the area of Zoom, end on time. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen, and I thank you, Dave, for the conversation. It's been great.
It's our absolute pleasure, and you know, we're so over the moon that you've been able to make it today. I just want to make a quick announcement before we close off, just to let our audience know that our next session will be on Thursday, the 17th at 11 a.m. That's 11 a.m. Eastern, with Ms. Fanta Williams, who's the country manager of Digicel St. Vincent, and she will be sharing with us her best practices for leading companies through COVID-19. Thank you to our audience. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the questions. I want to encourage everyone to stay safe and stay connected with CANTO Conversations. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Be well.